Hello, today I have the great fortune of getting a chance to talk to somebody whose name I've been reading for a long time, but who I've never actually talked to in person. So this is a real pleasure for me. His name's Marcel Wierckx, and he is a media artist that I'll let him define himself to you. But I find some of his work very compelling. Gregory introduced me to him. Gregory Taylor introduced me, and I'm very excited to have a chance to talk to Marcel. So let's do it. Hey, Marcel, how's it going?
Hey, great. Great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to have a chat with me. I really appreciate it, man.
No, there's no problem at all. Glad to do it.
So why don't we start off by having you describe yourself? Because when I look through your bio material as well as things that you've posted about your work, I could call you one of any 12 things, and I would be sort of right. So why don't I have you describe yourself to me?
Yeah, this is always a really difficult question for me to answer. I get this all the time. I like to see myself primarily as an audiovisual composer. So, as a composer that works equally on the visual and the sound domain. Although I've done a lot of traditional music composition for contemporary dance, and I also develop interactive systems for other artists. So I tend to write a lot of software, max
Interesting.
patches basically. Yeah.
Sure. So Max is your primary tool of destruction at this point?
At this point, I mean, I would have said a few years ago it was 80% of my work. Now it's nudged up to 95% of what I do in Max.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Is it mostly just because Max has improved or because you've improved your use of Max?
Well, a lot of the video work I used to do up until about, I guess, 2010 was done in After Effects,
Oh, okay.
and I've tended to abandon the this idea of the how shall I say it? Like the film model of
Oh,
working with
right,
video, right?
right.
Working in a timeline, working with like the camera image, the filmed image as the basis for the video stuff I do. And I've gotten a bit more into programming in OpenGL and gotten a little bit better at working with shaders and working with textures. I mean, I objected for a long time to OpenGL because it all looked so video game-ish.
Right.
Uh, but I've discovered in the past couple of years that it doesn't have to look that way, and I've tried to kind of make my own kind of individual look with video in the new JitGL and the JitSlab and stuff like that. Well, which isn't really that new anymore, but it's still kind of new for me. I'm still discovering new stuff every day with OpenGL.
So what are you doing? Because I too, working with OpenGL has always been something that I've avoided simply because at least when I do something, it does in fact look like a really bad Doom or something, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
What is it that you're doing that you feel like takes you past that, or allows you at least in the feeling of your own work to feel like you're getting past that?
I'm always leery of giving away the recipe to my secret sauce,
Oh,
right?
your secrets.
But
Well, you know what? Nobody listens to this podcast, so you're probably safe.
okay, so well, I have a feeling Greg will be listening, so he's
Yeah,
safe,
right.
right? So feedback, really, and feedback, of course, if feeding a texture back into a slab is an easy enough thing to do, right? It's the stuff that gets done in between the feedback, which is where you can get your really interesting stuff happening.
Sure, sure.
Right, and different kinds of noise. I mean, I really owe a big debt of gratitude to people like Xenakis that developed these ideas of how to deal with randomness in interesting ways. And I try to implement that a lot in like just little tiny grains of interesting randomness when they're amplified in a feedback loop can do so much more than just the typical kind of fractal images.
Sure, sure. That's an interesting point, and I think one of the things that I certainly noticed is, for a while when there was a long period of time where randomness was kind of treated like it was unique and always special. And then there was a time where people started trying to avoid randomness because it was like, well, we need to show direction and we need to show purpose and all that stuff. And I think
Right.
what it's led to is a very thoughtful approach to randomness, where people like Xenakis and others have sort of like sketched out ways to approach randomness that isn't just, throw a generic number on a thing and let it go crazy, but rather using it as an influence rather than the totality of the
Yeah,
output, right?
exactly. I just recently saw an interview with Xenakis that I hadn't seen before, where he was describing his method of composition like shooting a machine gun. Um, you don't know exactly where the bullets are going to go, but you have a pretty good idea, and you're the one directing the gun, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting metaphor, and I think that it's not really exactly the way I work, but it's definitely a way of looking at it.
Yeah, well, and like randomness, machine guns have a tendency to hurt nearby people as well. So,
Exactly, right.
so why don't you tell us a little bit about some of your most recent work?
Well, I just finished a piece. We got our last performance coming up soon with a new young choreographer, Jasper van Luik. And there we're filling the theater up with smoke and using beamers, in North American terms, projectors, um, to draw planes in the smoke. Now, this is a really old trick, but the thing that I've done is I've attached every little bit of light that the projectors are throwing into the space to a sound.
Hmm.
Um, and this is all going on together with a dancer. So I've really tried to it's about composing a system. So I'm performing the piece live, but I'm shooting pixels out into the space, which is filled with smoke, and the dancer's interacting with that, and I'm performing together with the dancer.
Wow,
But
that
it's
sounds
mostly this unification of the sound and the light that I think is working really well with that piece.
that really sounds like a lot of fun. Sounds pretty awesome. How did you get? Uh, is this your first time working with dancers, or have you been working with choreographers for a while?
I've been working with dance since I guess about 1999,
Oh my,
2000, something like
okay,
that. Since
okay.
back in my student days. Yeah. So.
Interesting. And is do you generally do well? It sounds like in this case you're doing both visuals and audio. Do you have a tendency to do one or the other? Do you always kind of combine them both into one unified work?
That's what I would like to do, but of course, with with choreographers generally, I'm not in charge of the project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm part of a team,
Right.
and so I always try to give my input of what I would like to see or what I would like to do. But generally, it's the choreographer or the producer, or the company, or something like that that comes up with the concept. So people tend to ask me for things that they know I'm good at, but the piece is not always doesn't always call for video or doesn't always call for technology.
Interesting. Now, do you do work outside of working with dancers? Do you do just straight composition for installation or for like like album release or like audio work, or do you do that kind of stuff, or
No,
or is this mainly your focus?
my only CD release was way back in 1994, and that was with a grunge band. So no, I haven't done
Nice.
any. I haven't worked in that model of production for a hugely long time. No, it's
Is it because you don't think it's valid, or is that just not where your voice takes you?
I've always resisted being a tape music composer. Um, I've always thought of myself as somebody who designs pieces with technology that need to be performed live.
Hmm.
Um, so this is something I've been really trying to focus on the last little while. But yeah, difficult question. Mostly I compose for something. I really can't remember the last time I composed a piece just out of kind of blind inspiration or something like that. So, a couple of my solo pieces were composed for the 4D sound system. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
I'm not.
It's a sound projection system with something like 92 speakers spread out across the space.
Okay.
I would encourage all your listeners to check out 4dsound.net. It's a really spectacular system. But I did a project with them last year, and working on a new project with them again this year. The pieces that I compose for dance, of course, they're, commissions, really, writing something for a specific concept, for a specific venue and stuff like that. So that really doesn't lend itself to, any kind of digital or
Right.
Any kind of release, really.
So I want to come back to that because you said something there that really resonates with me. But before we go there, one of the things that I like doing is talking to people about sort of their beginning story, how they came to be the artists or builder or maker or whatever that they are. And in your case, especially having this, this kind of focus on performance, but combination of visual and audio, and especially interacting with dancers and the live movement of that, it's a curious set of interests and capabilities, especially when you tie code into it, right?
Mm-hmm,
And I'm
mm-hmm.
curious, what's your background? How did you get to be where you are now?
Let's see. When I was about, I guess, 8 years old, I've got a brother who's about 10 years older than me. And we didn't have that much money. We weren't a really rich family, but my oldest brother was into computers. So he managed to get his hands on the parts to build an Apple II computer. We couldn't buy the ROMs, so he managed to burn the Apple ROMs from somebody else. I used to just kind of watch over his shoulder while he was soldering stuff together. I was really fascinated by that. And, when we finally got the thing up and running, he would turn it on and it would basically do nothing, right?
Right.
And I would watch him code things in assembly. And, he was more interested in engineering and mathematics and stuff like that. So the stuff coming out wasn't all that interesting. But one day, I guess, I don't know, I was about 11 or 12, and I realized how graphics work on that machine, that you just write, hex numbers into memory, and that's how you draw pixels on the screen. I started getting books and magazines about how to make video games. And, back then, if you wanted to play, or if I wanted to play a video game on the Apple II, I had to go buy a magazine with a video game in assembly language and type it over. Right? You type in the game and then it wouldn't work, of course, right? So you'd have to go through it to find out what you typed in wrong. And that was just an immense learning experience for me. But, by the time I hit 14 or 15, I completely abandoned computers and went into music and started playing guitar and, of course, started playing rock, right?
Mm-hmm.
And did that up until my 20s, kind of, computers were kind of in the background, but actually I have to admit between 15 and 20 years old, I don't think I actually even touched a computer because it was all just guitar, guitar, guitar.
Sure.
But then, I played rock for a while, and at a certain point, I thought, okay, I think I better get into serious music because I don't think I can handle the rock lifestyle for the rest of my life. And so I went to university and studied composition because I wanted to write string quartets. And a required course in the composition department was computer music, not computer music, electronic music. So, we learned about tape splicing, we learned about, generally all that kinds of stuff. And then we got to the unit of the course where we talked about software. My teacher showed me Max, which at that time was, Max version 2.5, I think. And he showed me how you could just send MIDI, system exclusive data and stuff like that to DX7s or TX18s. And really get the most outrageous sounds out of them. That really resonated with me. And then the first couple of assignments that I got in that class, the teacher said, where the heck did you learn all this stuff? And it just kind of came intuitively to me because I understood how, how hex numbers work and how data works on a computer, and how, how if you want to make a sound, you got to think of timing, you got to think of the speed of messages coming out and stuff like that. I mean, I'm kind of oversimplifying it, but I don't know. And that was kind of the moment that I thought, hey, wait a minute, I'm actually kind of good at this computer stuff. And I kind of really thanked my brother for that
Hmm.
at that time. So that's kind of how I got into computer writing Max patches for music.
And what were some of your first opportunities to make the transition from being a grunge band guitarist to being a composer? I mean, what did that transition look like? Were you like doing a bunch of stuff as part of your schooling, and then, uh, you met people there that opened doors, or was
Yeah,
it was it
yeah, it
something
was
else?
it was really my composition teacher at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Michael Matthews. He was a huge fan of writing max patches and writing music that way, but he always said he never had the time to pursue that in depth
Hmm.
because he was busy writing string orchestra pieces and stuff like that.
Okay.
But he was a big inspiration because he was the first one that kind of told me, these little 2 and 3 minute pieces that I was writing in Max at the time, that he said, is actually really unique and special what you're doing, and I think you should pursue this more. So yeah, that was, and of course, I didn't stop completely playing rock. To pay my way through university, I actually, I kept playing with the rock band, and I actually played in a 70s disco band for a while,
Wow.
which really helped. It paid the bills, but it wasn't musically satisfying. But
Right.
yeah, it was really kind of I don't know. I guess everyone kind of goes through this in their 20s. They make a switch and they realize, hey, I don't think I can keep doing what I'm doing now for the rest of my life. I think it was
Right.
kind of that.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. And how did you first get introduced to dance?
That was when I moved to the Netherlands in 1999, and I had started on a PhD in the Utrecht School of Music and Technology, and I never ended up finishing that PhD. But that's where I was introduced to some dancers from the dance group Christina de Châtel, which is a big dance group here in Holland, or was a big dance group here in Holland. It's not around anymore.
Hmm.
And yeah, I had. Do you remember the bomb object in Max?
Yes. Yeah.
I did
I
a
mean,
piece with that, that together with VNS, David Rokeby's system,
yes.
and we did a dance piece where I had a couple of, I guess that was the first generation G3 Max, and I had one running the bomb patch and one running VNS, and with two dancers, and we made a piece back then, which, yeah, it really got me excited about working with dance. I was really lucky to have met a couple of people that I think kind of got what I was doing, and were really willing to go along with me on that, and that was a really rewarding experience.
Yay. All right. Now I want to talk about this concept of composing for something, because I have to tell you, I personally seem to have a real problem doing recorded music.
Mm,
And I don't have a problem if I'm doing either something for a project or if I'm preparing for a performance. And I think what you hit on was the reason. If I'm doing a
mm,
piece for something, it gives me an explicit direction,
exactly. Yeah.
and then I have the focus to complete a project, and that doesn't seem to come naturally for me if my purpose is to say, "Oh, I'm going to make some music for release."
Yeah.
Saying that somehow feels like, well, I'm going to artificially create something that doesn't necessarily have meaning, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
You
maybe
know,
I'm
I
putting like too big of a envelope around it, but there seems to be something about accomplishing work that has meaning that, like, being being a self-directed artist doesn't.
yeah. There's this term here that in Holland that gets bandied about the zolderkamercomponist of the slaapkamercomponist, which is like the bedroom composer, or somebody that just puts in tons of hours in their attic or in their little home studio making music that nobody ever listens to. I've always dreaded the idea of nobody listening to my music. I've done pieces, of course, for instrument and tape, or instrument and live electronics and stuff like that, and it's really, really depressing to me to work really hard, really long, and pour all your blood, sweat, and tears in a piece that gets played 5 times for 20 people each time.
Right.
I think that was a big motivator for me as well for getting into dance, because that was my opportunity to have pieces played a bit more often, to play for an audience that is, not necessarily all other musicians or other composers.
Right.
And especially a younger audience as well, right? The dance audience is generally made up of a much wider demographic, young and old, than music concerts.
Right. I actually had a really interesting conversation. This last weekend, I was at the Berklee College of Music for their Voltage Connect thing.
Right,
And I was on a panel of people talking about performing with modular synthesizers, which is one of the things I do.
right.
And one of the questions from the audience was like, how do we generate gigs? How do we get out there and do this stuff? And, some of the suggestions were, well, build up a local scene or whatever. But my suggestion was to change your imagination of what a performance is. And I talked about working with dancers and how the audience seemed so appreciative of aggressively different music
Yeah,
because they weren't there to just be critical of the music. In fact, they were there, if they were going to be critical about anything, they were actually there to be critical about dancers. And
yeah,
so whatever music showed up, if it was different, that was just kind of like extra sauce on the sundae, right?
yeah, yeah.
And I too have found dance audiences incredibly receptive, but also dancers incredibly receptive to sometimes fairly aggressive experimentalism
Yeah,
because
exactly.
it pushes them as much as it's pushing you, and that seems to be something that they really embrace.
Yeah, yeah. Especially if you make music that doesn't oblige the dancers to do anything specific.
Right.
I generally don't work with pulse in my music.
Mm.
I mean, there's definitely rhythm, there's definitely beat, but I tend to not make music that forces the dancers into any kind of specific movement vocabulary or something.
Oh, that's interesting. I had someone come up from the audience actually and mention that he too, his girlfriend was a dancer, and he too had started working with dance and found it an incredibly freeing experience. Also that in there tends to be more people in the audience than if you do a coffee shop electronic music experimentalism gig, right?
Yeah.
There you're assured of having 3 people, at least
Mm.
one of whom is a homeless person looking to get warm, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but that's really interesting. Now, when you work with these groups, what does your performance rig look like? Are you like a one laptop guy? Are you a bunch of laptop guys, or do you bring like the truck full of gear?
This changes show by show, but generally, no, I'm not a truckload full of gear kind of performer. Um, for the audio video stuff I do, I've got a Mac Pro, one of those, the giant ashtrays, which
The
is
round
great.
ones?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
because that thing can handle a few video outputs. It's nice and portable, and that with an audio interface is pretty much my setup and a couple of
Hmm.
beamers.
Okay.
Back in the day, of course, when I first started with dance and with technology, it was really hip to have video cameras all over the place and
Right, right.
20 beamers and stuff like that. Although this last piece that I've done with Jasper van Lark, I think we got 6 beamers on the stage, which is a bit more than I would normally do. But
Yeah, that's a punch. Now,
yeah,
so that's not a strictly it's portable-ish, but it's not necessarily portable, and it kind of takes up a fair amount of room too, right? Now, do you tend to
Mhm.
tend to work like out of a booth with long wire runs, or are you like on side stage, or do you sit in the middle of the stage? How do you interact? Where do you set yourself up in the venue?
Yeah, that changes show by show. For this last piece, I'm on stage,
Okay.
on the side of the stage. Normally, I wouldn't want to be doing that unless I was doing something that's also interesting for the audience to see.
Hmm.
So I've done a piece with Anouk van Dyk where I was playing guitars and doing electronics. So at least then the audience, has got
It's something
something
to
to look
watch.
at.
Yeah.
I'm actually, I'm not just twiddling a controller, right?
Right.
But I mean, about the portability of my gear, I've got a setup now that I can do just about any of the pieces that I've done recently, and can take it all on carry-on baggage. So
Really? Wow.
yeah, it's been quite a mission of mine to get stuff carry-on size to perform with.
Well, but if you're using a Mac Pro, what do you use for a monitor with that?
Usually, I would just ask the venue to provide
Oh, I see. Okay. All
VGA.
right.
Yeah. I'd have a tech rider where
Uh,
just stuff that's not specific to me that the venue can provide easily. I mean, everybody's got
right.
an old VGA monitor lying
Right, laying
around. So,
around. Right. Good
yeah,
point. It's a good
I mean,
point. Well,
for
it's one of those things that it's not easy even to consider. Is I think it's a media artist thing, particularly.
mm,
We're so used to everything we do being so ridiculously weird that the
mm,
assumption is nobody else is going to have anything that can help, so that we have to literally
right,
haul everything around. And I have to admit that so often, I haul around 20 pounds of extension cords, even though I know that at most of these venues, they have more extension cords than God, right?
yeah,
But
exactly.
I still get like obsessed with like I need to make sure that I have everything, at hand and under my control. I think maybe that's kind of the way our art works, is that we have a tendency to also be maybe a little bit of control freaks.
OCD.
Yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I'm. It really depends on the gig. I mean, generally the dance pieces that I do, they're made together with a production house or a production company where we
Hmm.
we sit down and we talk about gear and we talk about what we're going to expect from the venue, what we're going to buy ourselves. I mean, these last few pieces that I did with Anouk van Dyk, um, it's really truckloads of gear, right?
Hmm.
So if I have my stuff in my carry-on, the stuff that's really specific to me, and if I can specify in adequate detail what the venue or what the production house has got to provide, I've never really had problems with that. It's really about being specific enough, right? It's the brown M&M story.
Right, right. Let's talk a little bit about the development of the work. My experience working with dancers, I primarily worked with just one dance group. And so we ended up with a very good collaboration because we did, you know, probably 8 or 10 pieces together, right?
Hmm.
And so initially it started off with them kind of coming to me with a preset thing, but relatively quickly it got to be a very collaborative development process.
Hmm.
You're working with a lot of different people.
Yeah.
What does the performance development look like? Do they work on movements and then you try and come up with sounds and visuals, or do you come with sonic and visual ideas that they build off of, or how is that working in your experience?
Yeah, the best working method for me with dance is me being in the studio. At least talking through concept and roughing out a couple of ideas with the choreographer in just at home or in my workspace, just to get an idea, make sure that we're both kind of on the same page. But the real work gets done together in the studio. So I'll have prepared a couple of instruments, as it were, software instruments that I've programmed, or sometimes little fragments of composition. I mean, it kind of depends on how the piece is going to run, if the piece is going to run without me, or if I'm going to really be performing the piece. But yeah, it's really what I've discovered is this recursion between the choreographer and the music, where I can, in rehearsal, if they're running a scene, sometimes I'll throw in a music that they haven't heard before, just to see what happens.
Right.
Um, And it's kind of luxurious to work with people like Anouk van Dijk because she tolerates that. Some choreographers, I think, wouldn't.
Right.
But she actually valued that because she said quite often the music would let her see her choreography differently. So it's really important. I spend a lot of time in the studio with the dancers, even talking about if there's something going on in the movement that I think should be different because of what my musical idea is. I'm not afraid to say that, and that's resulted in some pretty interesting scenes.
Interesting.
Not that I'm trying to take credit for choreography, because
Right.
God bless me, you don't want me choreographing a piece.
Right, but now one of my experiences that actually just really has stuck with me throughout was one of the first times I was working with this dance company. I did a thing that did some video delay work, right? And
Hmm.
it was really beautiful with the movement they were doing. So I did it. I showed it to them. They really enjoyed it. They kind of graphed out a piece of it, and that kind of became part of the performance. The next time I came, they had done further work on their movement, and they
Right.
had actually integrated some things that sort of were like their physical manifestation of what a visual feedback thing looks like. They basically took that as a concept and then
Yeah.
sort of like emulated it in real life, which was kind of
Yeah.
spooky. That was the point at which I felt like, well, this is something that's even more than a collaboration in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like almost a different kind of feedback circuit. Do you experience that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the best type of working situation, right? The virtuous spiral, where
Right.
good ideas beget more good ideas, and that's really exciting to be in that kind of situation. And the best choreographers I've worked with were not necessarily the ones that were dictatorially making the best choreographies, but were the ones that were opening up their rehearsal space to the specific abilities and talents of the people they had in the space.
Sure.
Everybody could contribute, and you got pieces that were just so much more than a sum of the people working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Now, from your experience, how much of what you do is like really intellectualized, and how often do you stumble into happy accidents?
That's a really good question. Um, I don't know. I guess it's about 70% happy accidents and 30% knowing what I'm doing. Quite literally. I mean, I think I did this piece called "An Active Now" together with Anouk van Dijk in Australia with Chunky Move,
Hmm.
and in my opinion, the best moment, kind of the climax in the movement, in the music in that piece is the dancers. Kind of hard to explain. The dancers are in a glass house, and for this performance, and when we were rehearsing, they were in this glass house, and they were kind of singing, just kind of improvising. I had a mic, a really good mic in the glass house at that moment, and I just kind of grabbed a sample of that, and I used that as a source, and I did some granular, and I did some processing on it, and it came out, and it's just the coolest piece of music. I could never have thought of that beforehand, that music. It was just because the dancers were kind of messing around, singing and having fun, that turned into a really great bit of source material. And generally, that's how I work. I find things, I stumble across things, and kind of massage them into musically interesting pieces.
Sure. That sounds fun. It sounds like you've really gotten a chance to do some work with some interesting people and some really open-minded people too. That's got to be a real joy to find those people and then to just find a way to not
Yeah,
let them go away, right?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the thing that I've learned is that with choreographers is that sometimes they say they know exactly what they want,
Hmm.
but if you confront them with different possibilities, they start to realize, oh, wait a minute, there's other things that I don't know are possible. And that's always been. I've seen that as my role as the composer in pieces.
Right.
Always with dance is to open up possibilities to different things, allowing different kinds of things to happen than what somebody might already know they can do. That they can stumble across things that they didn't know could happen.
Sure. Now, you talk about yourself as being a composer, but that's not typically something that someone who does visuals would call themselves, right?
Yeah,
Composer, we tend to think of the word composer as being very strictly tied, not even to sound, but specifically to music, right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, this has been a recurring theme in my life in the past at least 15 years or something.
Is it
Um,
something that you have to like explain away to people, or is it something you're
yeah,
trying to introduce them to?
well, I mean, back a long time ago when jitter was kind of starting to be useful, I was teaching at an institute here, and I said to kind of my superior, this jitter thing, we should buy a whole bunch of licenses and get into this, and there, some other video software, and I said because the stuff I'm doing with the students with music, they can basically kind of copy paste their ideas to the video domain, and we can do some really cool stuff. And I remember my superior at that time telling me, well, you know what, we're a music school, and if the students want to work with video, then they should go over to the next building and
Art
find a
school.
video guy, right, to
Mm,
collaborate with. And it frustrated me at that moment. And
sure.
so I kind of used some guerrilla tactics and just started teaching jitter in the classes anyway. Some really interesting students came out of that. Tarek Bari is one that came out of that period of
Wow.
my teaching career.
Yeah.
Peter Willems, a couple of really great students, Paul Holeman,
I,
lots of great guys came out of that period. Luckily I still teach there, and they're not nearly as close-minded, but it took a little bit of convincing.
Now, one of the things I often like asking people is what their future looks like, but it's kind
Mhm.
of I'm kind of curious where you'd go with it because if I'm talking to someone who is building gear, their future is like where is technology going to take me and the development of gear? Or if I'm
Right,
talking to somebody who is, who performs using a certain set of equipment, again, the equipment is sort of like the driving force of what their future looks like. But in
right.
your case, you seem to kind of float above, other than your sort of dedication to Max and Jitter, you seem to sort of like float above the influence of gear and mostly are focused on this collaborative and real time um, interaction with people and with sound and with
Hmm.
visuals.
Yeah.
So I don't even know how to structure a question about what does your future look like, other than to just say what directions do you see yourself being drawn? I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds like this OpenGL thing has been a generation of some ideas, but I'm just wondering, what are the things that drive you into future change?
Yeah, this is a really easy question for me to answer because I'm intensely busy with exactly this question right now. A couple of things. First is thinking about media and content in a completely different way. So the content of my pieces, whereas the typical audio-visual piece, you would think of the video track and the audio track and this kind of linear thing in terms of your frames or something like that. I'm starting to think of work in terms of process and content as being the code, right, or the max patch in my case,
Hmm.
oftentimes.
Hmm.
Um, but really composing in that medium instead of composing the music or the image, right? So thinking about data flow, data structure, stuff like that, and that being really the domain in which I'm composing. That is one thing. The other thing is the whole notion of participation in a technological society. What does participation mean for an audience? And I've been doing some spectacular work with a jazz band here in Holland right now called Tin Men and the Telephone. And they've got an app that the audience, installs on their phone when they come in,
Hmm.
and basically they compose music together with the audience during the show. So things like, somebody in the audience can leave a voicemail for the band, and the band uses that voicemail as a source for composing a piece on the spot. That kind of thing really excites me. The other thing is I'm working on a project together with Paul Holeman right now from 4D Sound, where we're going to be using basically web technologies. So people in the audience can just visit a web page, and their phones will be taken over and will become part of the performance. So these kinds of things I'm working on, and also getting away from the idea of screen and speakers as well.
Right.
So for these dance pieces I'm doing now, it's about, projecting on the floor, projecting in the space, getting away from this whole notion of, this 4:3 or 16:9 screen that you're staring at in a performance.
Sure.
And also with music, not necessarily just spatialization, but thinking music in much different terms, thinking of music in terms of how it can be linked in real explicit terms to what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. So, and this is, quite similar to the things that Tarek Bari has been working on. Also,
Right.
Robert Henke
Yeah, with
is
his
also
laser pieces, certainly getting away
exactly
from the
these laser
screen, right?
pieces. Yeah, yeah. Although I tend to see my work as much less engineering than composing, whereas
Right.
somebody like Robert Henke
Very
is
engineering driven.
spectacular.
Yeah.
Yeah, spectacular in terms of engineering, but on a musical level, I would see the kinds of things that I do on a completely different plane
Right.
than how he works.
Now, going back to the discussion about like composing with the medium instead of outside of the medium of code or whatever, or of working with participation, especially participation for devices and stuff. What one of the things that has, I hate to admit this because this is going to sound like either like I'm like an old guy shouting at kids on the lawn, or it's going to sound like somebody who just doesn't get it. But oftentimes, when I've seen work done that uses like phone technology or Twitter feeds or something like that, it seems trite to me.
Yeah.
And similarly, when I see things that sort of embrace code as the artistic medium,
Hmm.
it often seems like it might be a very advanced use of code to make what seems to be trite artwork.
Yeah.
What can you do to avoid that? What can you do to sort of like transcend the artifice of either the code or the iPhone as being the interesting thing in a participatory or a medium based artwork?
Yeah. Yeah. In my audiovisual work, so things like black noise, white silence, and white light, black static, I was really thinking about impact on the viewer. So I was really, the working on the code and stuff like that. There's this kind of period in the project where I obsess about getting the code right. But in the end, when I actually make the piece, I'm primarily concerned with how can I grab somebody by the hair and make them feel something, right? It
Sure.
sounds a little bit aggressive, but that's really I won't do anything unless it can have that sense to it. And with with this jazz band that I work with Tin Men and the Telephone, the first thing for them always is the music's got to be good, the playing's got to be good. They got to be pushing themselves musically really hard every night, and
Mhm.
the electronics and the interaction and all that kind of stuff that is supposed to be there to influence that. But the primary thing is these are spectacularly good musicians, and that's what the audience has to go home remembering. The electronics, the interaction, the stuff with the iPhones and stuff like that is there to help them realize that. So it's really about the people. It's really about the human experience. And I love working with code. I love, messing around with shaders and stuff like that. But none of that matters when the performance is actually happening. At that moment, you got to be thinking of the people that are in the space, that you're sharing an experience together with the people. And I'm really adamant about that.
Well, Marcel, that was very well stated, and I think is probably something that should be like tattooed on art students' forearms when they're going through school, right?
Right.
I really appreciate that view on it because it seems to me to be, I think we have to embrace these things because they really are the future, but it's so hard to do it when when you see things being used in a pointless way. But I guess that's always been sort of the trap of using technology in art, which is sort of like the first pass concept with any technology behind artwork is to glorify the technology,
Right.
and it takes a while to maybe your background as a grunge guitarist actually does come to be a real valuable part of grabbing people by the hair, right?
Maybe, yeah. Yeah.
Well, Marcel, I want to thank you so much for the time. I've used up my time already, and I appreciate the chat. One last question for you.
Sure.
For somebody, uh, for a newbie listener that might be wondering, well, how do I get into working with dancers, or how do I get into doing a thing like you're doing? What is your suggestion? How do people get started? What what would be the path that you would suggest that people take now?
Make friends, get out of the house, stop working in your bedroom and go to performances and go to there's quite often when I do dance performances, at the end of the performance, we would, put a couple of chairs on the stage and chat with the audience or stuff like that. Make personal contacts with people, search people out whose work you like, and get out there, because it's really easy to get sucked into your laptop as a person. And you got to realize that these personal connections are really important, and be critical. Find people that you really like, and decide for yourself what you like about them, about their work, and kind of just go for it. It sounds, I don't know, maybe that sounds like a bit of an empty answer, but that's kind of what worked for me, really. And I guess the other piece of advice is, no matter what, make your most excellent work, which also sounds kind of like an empty thing to say, but it's really true. Never let yourself get lazy. No matter what project you're working on, whether it's a €100,000 budget or a €10 budget, always put 100% of yourself into it.
So good, so smart. Well, thank you so much again for your time and for being so open to talk about not only your work but how you perceive people can work. It's really great.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. It was really enjoyable.
Indeed. All right, thanks a lot, and we will talk again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Many thanks to Marcel for that great overview of what he does and how he does it, and some really nice introspection there about the whole process and how you work your way into doing significant work. Thanks to him on that. Thanks to you, the listeners, for showing up again. I really appreciate it. Hang on, because we've got plenty more coming. We've got some really interesting people booked for the next couple of weeks, so I'm looking forward to talking to these folks and to share their stories with you. With that, I just want to again remind you to hashtag tripod, TRYPOD, to let your friends, family, and everyone else know a little bit about what you're listening to. Share this podcast if you can. And but otherwise, I will see you next week. Bye.